So welcome to another panel discussion with the Washington Examiner. I'm Rob Crilly, and with me today is Ambassador Nikki Haley. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Rob. It's great to be with you.
I guess I'll start off. We're still in the middle of this pandemic, and the question I ask everybody is, where am I talking to you from? Are you at home? Are you in the office, on the road, or where are you?
Well, we've been a lot of everywhere. Right now, we're at home in South Carolina, but I just came off of a leg from New Hampshire to Texas to Arizona, and I'll be headed to Montana and Iowa from here.
Well, I guess that gets me straight into the first question. I mean, it's almost 2 years since you stepped down as the United Nations permanent representative to the UN, and people will be wondering what you've been up to. It sounds like you're busy on the election trail, but what have you been doing for the past 2 years?
Well, I absolutely loved my job at the United Nations. It really was the job of a lifetime, serving the country I love so much. But my son was a senior in high school, and I wanted to be with him as he was doing his college visits. And so it was time for me to leave to take care of family. But I knew I was too young to stop fighting, and I love policy. So a couple of things, I went ahead and wrote a book, With All Due Respect, Defending America with Grit and Grace. And I did that because I know history will say what it's going to say about my term as governor and UN, but I wanted people to feel the emotion. I wanted them to know what it was like after the church shooting behind the scenes. I wanted them to know what it was like when we were negotiating on Syria with the Russians. I wanted them to know what it was like when we were, on the Simon Bolivar Bridge between Venezuela and Colombia. And so it allowed me to put the emotional side into that. The second side was I had two children at the time that were 18 and 20, and I knew they didn't get their news from television or newspaper. I knew that they got it from social media. And so I started a platform called Stand for America that really just gives an policy ideas to the younger generation so that they can kind of see the conservative slant. So things on Medicare for all, or capitalism versus socialism, or the Green New Deal, and gives articles for them to read. So we've been involved in that, and that's been gangbusters. And then obviously now it's campaign season. So campaigning anywhere and everywhere to get just good new officials elected and to re-elect some officials that have really worked hard.
So it sounds like you've taken in a whole bunch of states, some battleground states. I mean, it looks like it's been a tough few weeks for President Trump. How do you see his chances of re-election now from what you're picking up on the ground?
Well, if there's one thing I've learned, never underestimate President Trump. I mean, I think we saw that in 2016 in both the primary as well as in the general. I think we'll see that here now. But what I'll tell you is there's really a lot at stake, and that's what's being talked about in the states. It's the idea of we're seeing play right now, a conservative Supreme Court versus a liberal Supreme Court. Capitalism versus socialism, rule of law and respect of law enforcement, or lawlessness and riots, tax cuts and putting more money in people's pockets versus a $4 trillion tax increase, foreign policy where America led through strength, sometimes upsetting our enemies, China and Iran, versus a foreign policy alignment where you buy friends with foreign aid. So there really is a lot at stake. And I think that the American people see the strong policy differences in front of us. And I think, we're going to work hard until Election Day and see what we can do to get a win.
I mean, you say you should never write off President Trump, but looking down the battleground states, I mean, he's trailing in Florida by 3 points, Pennsylvania 6 points, Michigan almost 8 points, Wisconsin more than 7 points. I mean, it doesn't look good, and I just wonder if there's something you want to see happen in the campaign, something that should be done in the next 3 weeks that perhaps can start to turn around some of those poll numbers.
Well, it didn't look good in 2016 either, and we came out with a really big win. What you have to remember with polls is a lot of people aren't going to tell you where they are. A lot of people, especially women, don't go and wear their political beliefs on their sleeve. They like to keep it close to the vest. And so I think that, look, we're going to plan for President Trump's second term. I think the best surrogate we have is the president, and the idea that he's out there doing rallies and and talking to people again is really important. It allows people to hear from him directly on what he wants to do. And I think that's the same for many Senate candidates and House candidates as well. As you know, during COVID, it's been difficult, but they're doing their best to get the policies out in front. And I think that the last poll that they showed about whether people felt like they were better off than they were in 2016, the idea that 57% said they were, you know, in spite of COVID, says a lot. And I've always believed that people, you know, on election day, they vote their circumstances. And I think that they'll see that their circumstances and these policies will take them to a better place as opposed to going backwards.
I mean, the pollsters have worked quite hard to try and avoid the mistakes of last time. They're adjusting more for educational attainment, for example. I mean, do you really still contend that the polls are not picking up the true position?
Well, we don't know. You know, I mean, the thing is, and he could be down, and he was down in 2016, or people could be hesitant about saying who they're voting for. Regardless, you know, we'll find out on election day. We're pushing hard. I'd love to see President Trump win again. I saw firsthand at the United Nations the difference between, you know, leading through strength versus, you know, buying friends with foreign aid. And I know the difference that that can mean in the world. I know that we have a lot going on in different regions, and I think we have a lot going on at home and trying to tackle COVID and hold China accountable and continuing to try and take on the economy and get small businesses back open again and kids back in school. All of these things are really, really important to just everyday families that want to get back on their feet and want to get back to normalcy.
One of the themes of these discussions is conservatism and what it means to the people we're talking to. You famously shot to prominence as part of the Tea Party movement, and I wonder if you could just maybe set out how you see conservatism today, and having been a key part of the Trump administration that has perhaps some more populist views on what conservatism means. I just wonder how you see your politics and maybe how it's evolved in the past few years.
Well, I mean, I think I've always believed that conservatism is freedom at home and strength abroad. You know, we are the greatest country in the world because we're the freest country in the world. And I saw that, you know, directly at the United Nations, and it was pretty stark. You know, we have economic freedom because of capitalism and because of limited government. We have moral freedom because of religious liberty and freedom of speech, which are enshrined in our First Amendment. We have personal security because, you know, we believe in the rule of law, and we have the best military in the world. And I'll tell you, Rob, when you look at countries and you're face to face with China and Iran and Russia and North Korea, and you see what happens to those people, and you see what the lack of freedom does to an economy, a quality of life, and opportunities for people. I mean, there's no question. You know, I'm a military wife. My husband deployed to Afghanistan. We know as a family the blessings that we have with freedom. And that's what conservatism is. It's all about making sure that you can lift people up to as high as they want to be, that they will be as free to say and believe whatever they want to believe. And you can't put a value on that. And I will tell you that, you know, when you talk to the people of Venezuela, or you see what's happening to the people in Syria, or you look at the Muslim Uyghurs in China, you know, conservatism is about freedom. And I hope that that's something that we always put a lot of weight on.
We'll come on to your work at the United Nations in a second, but one of the things I've been struck by this year is, I mean, obviously the year has been dominated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And part of the response here has been stimulus payments, trillions of dollars spent in supporting businesses, supporting families to try and just keep the economy ticking over until we're in a better place. I just wonder what that sort of response, whether that's a challenge to a small government, low tax kind of conservatism, or whether it's a necessary part of the response, how you see that sort of thing.
Well, I mean, you know, the stimulus programs have been pretty frustrating to me. I mean, I think that, you know, one, that when you value a dollar and you value that this is taxpayer money, the idea that we saw, you know, Wall Street companies get, you know, millions of dollars, and we saw small businesses not necessarily get it. The idea that we saw hospitals who had lots of COVID patients get less money than hospitals who had less COVID patients. It goes to the fact that anytime you pass a stimulus without accountability, without transparency, and without a plan, bad things happen. You know, they're talking about another level of stimulus, and we haven't finished spending the first round. You know, I think it's really important going forward, once we get past COVID, that Congress understands and lays out a plan that should we ever go through any sort of crisis again that's similar to this, that when it comes to stimulus, when it comes to lifting people up, that you do it in a way that truly lifts up the people we want to lift up. You know, those that have been unemployed, those who are having to take care of their families, not the guys on Wall Street that have the big accountants and the big lawyers that know how to get the PPP money. It's about those small business owners that typically only have 30-day cash flow to carry them, if that. And we didn't see that really perform the way I would have, really preferred that happen. And I think that you can never loosely look at a dollar being spent, because every bit of that has to be paid back. And I'll tell you, our children and our grandchildren are not going to be happy with how that money was doled out.
Perhaps you could talk us through your decision to leave the board of Boeing, because I think this was part of the central question, right?
Well, I will tell you, I absolutely love Boeing. It is a company that I worked with for many years, getting the plant started up in South Carolina and continuing to grow and expand. And so I have a great respect for Boeing and what it's done in South Carolina and who it is as a company. But when COVID hit and they wanted to go the route of a bailout, that just goes against everything I believe in. I believe that when times like that happen, if government does step in, it's to help the small business guy, it's to help the worker, it's to help those families. It's not there to help big companies. And the company needed to go in a direction that they felt was to lean on government. I opposed, and I just, I believe in being a team player, and I just couldn't be a team player on that. So I certainly wish Boeing well, but there's times where you have to make decisions on what you believe, and that was just something I couldn't stand by.
But a couple of months after that, Boeing announced it was laying off 12,000 workers. I mean, this has this trickles down to the ordinary worker. I mean, does that give you pause for thought and make you wonder whether you made the right decision, or do you stand by?
No, I knew the finances of Boeing. I was very aware of what their finances were. And I'll remind you that, they're saying that 67% of restaurants are going to be closed in New York City by December. I mean, when you look at, 90% of our economy is small business, yes, you can go and try and salvage the big companies, but they have the leverage. They have the ability to pull money. They have the ability to borrow. Your small business guys don't have that. I grew up in small business, and I grew up in my family's business, and I started keeping the books for them when I was 13. And what I remember more than anything is when times were tough, you stretched that dollar, you prioritized, and you cut. And when times were good, you never celebrated, because you knew the hard times were happening again. And it's that small business mindset that I've just always held on to, because those are the ones that move the ball. They may not employ the 12,000 people, but their ripple effect in what they do to an economy and a community and then a state is huge. And we always have to look out for them first.
Well, you brought up earlier some of the work you did at the United Nations. And I mean, I imagine, I've covered it myself, and I have friends who work in other missions there, and that must be all consuming. Your social life revolves around diplomatic receptions and so on. I mean, do you miss all of that? Was it exhausting, or how do you look back on it now?
Well, I continue to say the United Nations is not for the faint at heart. There is no social life when you're at the United Nations, that's for sure. I was not one that went to all the diplomatic receptions, but I will tell you, every day felt like I put on body armor. I knew there'd be a fight. I just didn't know what country we're going to fight that day. I mean, you're going there and you're watching murderers and thieves and dictators go and try and oppress their people, or try and integrate into multilateral organizations so that they don't get called out. We just saw the United Nations Human Rights Council, which I pushed hard for us to get out of. We just saw yesterday that they elected China and Russia and Cuba and Pakistan to their membership. And so it's not a level playing field, but it's an interesting concept because you have 193 countries who all come together in the name of peace. And that's admirable. And that's something we all want to strive to be. The difficulty is you have 193 countries that don't all have the same values. And that's where the disconnect happens, is where you put your priorities, where you want to see. We saw Russia, China, and Iran, none of them liked our democratic values. None of them appreciated our freedoms. None of them thought that people should have that much of a voice and that much of a say in their life. They like to control. And when you see that up close and personal, it's stark and it's bone chilling. But I will tell you, I believed in America. And so sometimes that meant standing alone. And what I saw is there were countries that resented us. They were countries that wanted to stab us in the back. But all of those countries wanted to be us. And they would tell me that in back rooms, that they loved the fact that we had freedom of speech. They loved the fact that we could worship, freedom of worship anywhere that we wanted. And they loved that it didn't matter where you were born and raised, that you could be anything you wanted to be in this country. And so there were many conversations and many friends I made with multiple countries, and have a great respect for those ambassadors that serve. But it's a difficult place that requires not letting your guard down.
I mean, you mentioned sometimes the right thing to do is to stand alone. I think here maybe of the Iran nuclear deal, and I just wonder there whether standing alone was really the best course. I mean, having the US having withdrawn from the deal, we see that Iran has since enriched 4,600 pounds of uranium, and it feels as if Iran has gone from a regional problem to a regional problem plus a nuclear program problem. Do you have any regrets about withdrawing from the
No
Iran nuclear
regrets
deal?
at all. No regrets at all. That's what Iran wants you to think. I think what you look at is we literally sent planes full of cash to a country that is the #1 sponsor of terrorism, in the hopes, and I've talked with Secretary Kerry about this, in the hopes of stalling what they were doing, not stopping what they were doing, stalling what they were doing. And so what we saw was all of that money basically allowed them to funnel their tentacles to where they were supporting terrorism with the Houthis in Yemen, with Hamas in Gaza, with Hezbollah in Lebanon. I mean, it was just rampant on what they were doing in Syria and Iraq. And so what we found is that, look, the one thing when you have a bad actor that's getting away with spending a lot of money for bad things, you pull that money back. They were violating multiple United Nations resolutions, and you can't turn a blind eye to that, or else those resolutions aren't ever going to mean anything. And so what we said to Iran was, look, we're not going to put up with it anymore. If you play by the rules, we will be able to partner with you. But if you're going to continue this sort of activity, we're not going to be a part of that. And so pulling out of the Iran deal was acknowledging a truth. It was acknowledging the fact that this wasn't working. And I think that a lot of times we see public officials, we see representatives, they go and they come up with an agreement, and they live and breathe by the agreement because they don't want their pride to be hurt. What's more important is whether it's an agreement or legislation or anything else, when you see it's not working, you have to have the courage to say it's not working, we deserve better.
I mean,
And so
I accept that, but the upshot is Iran is now more dangerous than it was before. I mean, if you look at the results, you haven't got the result you wanted.
Iran has less cash than it has before. Its economy is plummeting. They are talking a big game about nuclear production. But if they had had that money that they had before versus having no money now, the damage that they were doing and the lives that were being lost because of it were different. You look at Soleimani. I mean, the man, there was a reason no country celebrated his death. He told basically all of those terrorist proxies who to kill, when to kill, how to kill. The fact that we flat-footed the Ayatollahs to where they had no number two. They are weaker in their dominance. They are weaker in their surrogates and their ability to push terrorism. They're weaker in their nuclear production. They will talk a big game because they're desperate. They're praying that President Trump doesn't get reelected so that they can go back. What President Trump is saying is, let's dwindle them down to where they're so weak that they have to come back to the negotiating table. That's what we want. We want them to come back to the negotiating table. But this time it'll be real negotiations where they're held accountable and where we're not going to allow them to support terrorism. And I'll tell you, the reason why we're not isolated in that instance is look at Israel and look at the Arab countries and how grateful they are for the stance we've taken on Iran. That has actually been one of the major causes why we now have the Abraham Accord signed, to have peace in the Middle East, to have peace between Israel and Bahrain, and peace between Israel and the Emiratis, and Kosovo acknowledging that they're going to put an embassy in Israel. All of this was because the president's first foreign policy summit was to the Arab summit saying, let's all unite against terrorism. And the reason those accords were signed was because this was the first president, Republican or Democrat, that said that peace in the Middle East is not going through the Palestinians. Peace in the Middle East is by acknowledging the threats that Iran is doing to every country in the region. And so I think that we have had so much progress by pulling out of the Iran deal. I don't think that it's over with peace in the Middle East. And I think decades from now, we will look at this as a defining truth on what really opened the door to stopping terrorism and accepting peace in the Middle East and what could be in that region.
Well, we're out of time, but it would be amiss of me not to just ask one final question, which is what comes next for you? Because a lot of people have plotted out your next 4 years very clearly. So what's next?
Well, a lot of people like to plot out what mine and others' next 4 years are going to be. What I'm going to tell you is we're going to push hard to get President Trump elected. We're going to try and get senators and congressional members elected. I'm going to continue to push good policy through Stand for America and work with members of Congress on things like Hong Kong and China, the way we have recently. And we're going to continue to push good things. I have not been a candidate for 6 years now. I am not in a hurry to be a candidate, but I will continue fighting because I know I'm too young to stop fighting.
Ambassador Haley, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much, Rob.